Richard Serra, and talking about this piece here, which is the one-ton prop, which is also referred to as House of Cards. So he's using industrial materials, this big square steel plate, and literally kind of balancing them next to each other. So there's sort of a contrast that's happening here, right? This material that's heavy, rugged, durable, aggressive, maybe in the sense of in an industrial kind of way. But then there's also fragility, and maybe also a little bit of fear as well. I probably should have recommended, he also had done some pieces in I don't know what kind of yard they were in. It was like an industrial supply, kind of place, and they were these big slabs of concrete that I think were used on construction sites to cover an open hole or something, basically to keep, so they could drive vehicles over the top of it. So there's big slabs of reinforced concrete. And what he did is he would stack them up one on top of each other. And what would happen with them is then they would also start to lean. So they became these really unstable kind of structures. And they were really, very temporal kinds of pieces. And those worked, and so we really only know them through photographs. And those have become known as the skull cracker series, which I think is interesting, because this idea they tip over, and you're standing nearby, there's certainly an element of danger. And this has that kind of quality to it as well. Shortly after he's working with these materials, we're kind of right around the same time, there's some overlap there. He's also working, in addition to working with steel and industrial materials, he also began working with lead. And this is a really well-known photograph of him. There's a series of photographs that seem to have been taken on the same day when he was working. This particular one seems to be the kind of iconic image of him working on the series. And basically what he was doing, he's got a propane tank here that basically has a burner that attaches directly to it, which is this here, and then there's a crucible sitting up above. And he was melting lead, and you can see he's wearing a respirator, which is good, so there's some concern for safety here. So he was melting lead, dipping it with a ladle, and then either flinging it on the floor of the studio or into the corners of the walls. And then it creates this kind of splatter in a sense. But he's building up layers of it, so then after it cooled, and lead cools relatively quickly, then he can literally, peel it up and then, kind of, in some cases, manipulate those pieces, but in others, literally just peel them and then create installations with them. So and we'll come back to this image here because there's something interesting about this, or that I have found interesting. So this is a detail of some of those pieces. This is in a particular installation. And you can see these edges that you see here, these kind of right angles that you see, come from where the lead has been, it's almost like he's casting in a sense, where the lead has been cast up against the wall, and when it's peeled off, it retains that. And so that's a detail. And then this is a more contemporary installation of one of those pieces, including some that's been, that was actually done in place and the others in there. So, and this is why I think that you can really see pretty early on that, Serra's working within this kind of visual vocabulary of minimalism, this idea of cubes and squares, repetition of very, kind of basic kinds of forms. But there's a more organic quality to them, even though he's kind of working, both with these modular, kind of regular forms, but also there's an element of, there's kind of pattern and variation and, kind of organic chaos that's happening as well. And so the material is, by making references to the walls, it comes together at right angles, there's that regularity, but they also have that really coarse, surface and that kind of rough edge, kind of all at the same time. In some ways, I always feel like there's a little hangover, or I don't know if that's the right word, hangover sounds bad. There's a kind of carryover, that's the word I'm looking for. I think there's a kind of carryover from abstract expressionism. And because if you think about abstract expressionism or abstract expressionist paintings, A lot of the works are conceived, or not so much conceived of by the artist, but talked about, from the outside as being like a record of the artist's actions. So I think as somebody like Pollock, is for a good example. And in a lot of ways, these are very similar. That these forms that we see, you can kind of imagine how the artist is creating the forms, and that's really different from somebody like, say, Donald Judd, where everything seems, like it's produced in a machine shop, and you don't necessarily see the hand of the artist. To come back to this image, I've thought about one of the things about, let me kind of backtrack a little bit. One of the things about Richard Serra is that I've mentioned is that he's an artist who's still very much alive and working today. And we'll see some later work and then some more recent work in kind of the direction that where his work goes. And he's considered today to be a really significant contemporary artist. He's got work all over the world. He's represented by top-notch, kind of blue-chip galleries. And so in reference to that, to come back to this image here, some years ago, I was looking at this image and I was thinking about it, and I was trying to figure out why there was something about it that seemed really familiar. And I don't know when, I can't remember exactly when I made the connection, and it's probably, again, because I'm not a historian, but I had this aha moment when I realized that this photograph catches him in this pose that's a lot like this very well-known image of, it's a Greek sculpture, Greek bronze, that's either Poseidon or Zeus. It's unclear. It depends on whatever he was holding in his hand would identify him as one deity or the other. And I realized that this image sort of captures him in this kind of heroic position, in a sense, where he's flinging lead. If he's Poseidon, he's got a trident in one hand, or if he's Zeus, he's got a thunderbolt. But this is kind of the artist as hero, and that's an idea that's still clinging to artists, especially in the 1960s and through the 70s. And again, that's also kind of carryover from abstract expressionism of artists as these, rugged individuals who are expressing themselves, for kind of really manly, kind of men. These are sort of some of the attitudes that kind of cling to this kind of myth of the American artist, or just the male artist for the time. So I find it interesting that that's the image that tends to get repeated. When you look at Serra's work, then he begins to move away from, although he had done these kind of temporary outdoor installation pieces, he was also doing, as you see in those last few images, installations indoors. And then he begins to move his sculptures outdoors, and he becomes known as a public artist. And when this piece here, which is called Tilted Art, was installed in the early 1980s, it turned into a huge controversy. And I'm curious, is anybody familiar with the controversy around this? So some of you are. How have you come across this? Has it been in another class with me or elsewhere? Okay, so you got. Yeah, so what was the controversy? Do you remember what was the controversy? If you don't, it's unpacked, but I want to put you totally on the spot.
There was I think it's in New York, is that where it was?
Yeah, it was in New York City, or it is in New York City.
Like the subway entrance, and it completely threw off the travelers' path. They would have to walk around one way or another to get around it, and just lengthen the path they had to go to get to the subway. Yeah,
it's in a plaza between several large buildings. Do you want to add something to that, maybe?
Just that people, like the community was very upset about it and didn't like it. They didn't think it was really that aesthetic, and they thought it was more of a hindrance.
Yeah, it's like because it has this appearance of basically being like a big wall or kind of fence in a way that bisects the space. And I have two views of it here. The photograph of it from up above gives you a sense of the scale and kind of how it crosses the plaza. And then the other view from down below, and also you can see a person in the background, maybe also gives you a sense of scale, but it also allows you to see how much the panel of steel curves, but it's also tilted as well, so it's kind of tilting into your space. So what happens is around this time period, Serra starts creating sculptures like this, which really are becoming large in scale. The pieces are no longer 3 or 4 feet high, but 8 and 10. His kind of panels are 8 to 10 feet high. And he's also working with Corten steel, which is an industrial material. And the thing about Corten steel is it's used in industrial applications. It's used in buildings and shipbuilding. pretty commonly, because what it does is, and art, and eventually, and Serra is one of the artists that helps popularize the use of Corten steel, is because when it gets a surface kind of rust on it, when it's often referred to as the patina, and it seals the surface of the steel so that the rust doesn't penetrate any further into it. So it retains its structural integrity, even though it's got this kind of surface, kind of rusty oxidation on that exterior layer. So he's interested in some of the what we might think of as the formal properties of steel. Because one of the things about steel, one of the reasons why steel is used in so many different kinds of applications is because it has really high tensile strength, which means it's really strong. And part of what makes it strong is that it's flexible. So it has a lot of bend to it. And if you've ever been has anybody been in a really tall building this happens in Chicago, some places, where skyscrapers actually will sway in the wind? You're nodding your head, Mike, have you had that experience?
What's the tower called there in Chicago?
Hancock Building? Yeah, and it's a weird feeling, right? Because you're in this, you think of buildings as being these very solid forms, but if you're on an upper floor and it's windy, you can actually feel it.
Once. It was the first time I had ever been in a skyscraper,
Mm-hmm.
and I was on on the 32nd floor or something, and it was a really gusty day.
And that's when you can feel that kind of buffer. So, and
it's
that's
like being on a ship almost.
Yeah, there's a kind of movement, and the wind is like a current. So and that's because of steel. So it's a good thing, and it's in with airplanes. Have you ever been in an airplane to see the wings are bobbing up and down? That's good. You want that to happen actually, because if they don't, they're brittle and they'll break, right? Even though it makes you kind of nervous to realize
It's really
that
funny.
it's unnerving.
That juxtaposition, because like a lot of people, even though it's educated that we know that, a lot of people we default to the thought of something being sturdier if it doesn't flex.
Yeah, and that's an interesting idea, that if something's rigid, it's strong, but flexibility is actually stronger in that respect. And those are a lot of ideas that Serra was really interested in. So his reason for curving the panels and tilting them, and over time he'll be able to do this even more so. And I think that's where his work becomes. People are able to accept it more, be more comfortable with it. He's just kind of getting to those ideas, or he's still kind of limited, sort of by funds and technology at this point. So anyway, we'll get to work where we can see a difference, or kind of a change in the way that this work looks. So the controversy here is that this sculpture was a part of something that's called a Percent for the Arts program, and that's something that developed in the 1960s. So today I think we're pretty comfortable with this idea of seeing art in public places. Like you go to any city, you walk in a street in a city, and you see some big, usually metal sculpture on the corner or in a plaza or maybe in a building. And what happened was in the mid 1960s, I think it's 1964 when this happens. There's a federal program that makes this. They make this decision that for every new federal building that's created, 1% of the total budget of the building will be used to commission artwork. And so how the work gets commissioned kind of varies from building to building. And the idea behind that, what was kind of fueling that thought, was that art is good for society. That art in public places is a good thing. That makes communities more vibrant and better. Art is one of those kind of earmarks of a healthy, vibrant society. So this program was developed around that time period. So this sculpture was commissioned as a part of one of those Percent for the Art programs. So there was a federal building, and I'm not sure that you see it in. I'm not sure that it's this. I don't think it's this building. I think it's a building, but I'm not 100% sure from this angle. But it's basically in this plaza. So this federal building is constructed. Serra wins the commission to create this sculpture. The sculpture is realized. It's put into place. And one of the things for Serra, too, is that he created this work with the concept of it being site-specific, meaning that he visited the site, he conceived of the work as working in this particular location. So it wasn't something that was designed to go anywhere. It was designed to go in this particular place. And also in this time period, in terms of other sculptures he's creating like this, he was interested in the idea that these sculptures break up the normal flow. and it's meant to kind of sort of shake you up a little bit. And if you think about minimalism and those earlier works we looked at, where one of the ideas of minimalist sculpture is that it's not about the object itself, it's about how it interacts with the space and how you make, use that space or understand that space differently. You can see where Serra's also connected to those ideas. So what happened was after the sculpture was put into place, then people started complaining about it. And some of the complaints were that people didn't like it, that when they wanted to walk across the plaza, they'd have to walk around it. They couldn't just walk directly in a straight line from one side to the other. And interestingly, the common story about this, about the controversy was that, masses of people hated it. The people that worked in the buildings hated it, and they all worked together to protest it. There was, the truth of that is, though, that there was a lawsuit that was brought against, and it wasn't so much against Serra as it was against the commission, and the people who were responsible for the sculpture in the first place. And basically they wanted the sculpture removed. And then Serra ends up fighting it, so it goes into a court battle. Serra fights it because and his argument was the piece is site-specific. The people who commissioned it knew what they were getting. It wasn't, a surprise to them. They had gone through all the proper approval processes, and that it couldn't go anywhere else. It was designed, to be for this, location, and that's where it should stay. So it goes into, a legal, situation. And then, as it turns out, at the end of it, Serra loses the lawsuit. The people who were against it end up winning. The sculpture was removed and sold for scrap. And so the photos that we see here are from around 1982. The sculpture was only up for about a year, maybe a little bit less than a year, and then was removed. And that was the story that I had always learned when I was a student going through school. And then it wasn't actually that long ago, maybe 5 or 6 years ago, that I was reading some articles about it, and there's a kind of revisionist thinking about that controversy. And somebody started doing some real research into, who was really behind that lawsuit and who was really upset by it. And it turns out that there were really a pretty small number of people who were upset by it. But they were people who were well educated, and several of them were lawyers. And so they understood the system and they knew how they could kind of go at it. But the public perception in terms of news articles was that people hated the sculpture. Right, everybody hates the sculpture, but there was a lot of kind of spin doctoring. The other part of the story that I left out of it, there was also a concern, and I'm not really sure how truthful this was, but it was one of the things that came up in the trial was that because it was a federal building. Keep in mind this is a long time before 9/11. It's even quite a ways before the bombing of the Timothy Bay bombing of the federal building. In Oklahoma City, but one of the arguments they used against this was that because of the angle of the wall and the fact that it appears as if it's just resting, on the ground, but there's actually pins. There's these foundation pins that pin it into the plaza. Was that if a bomb was set, and I think it was on this side, if a bomb was set on this side of the wall and went off, it would deflect the blast into the building that was adjacent here, and because it was a federal building, that could be dangerous. So it was this kind of irrational fear, especially for the time period. Maybe more of a fear now, maybe a somewhat more rational fear now, but definitely an irrational fear, for the early 1980s. So it's people's security and safety, was at risk as well. Now, the thing that I've always found really interesting about this is this piece and the controversy is around 1981, 1982. Also, right around the same time period, there was huge controversy about this sculpture, which really it functions a little differently. It's functioning as a memorial rather than as a kind of standalone work of art. But a very interesting kind of sort of controversy spun up around it. So this is a sculpture by Maya Lim called the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. I'm curious if anybody's seen it. Anybody gone to Washington, D.C. and experienced it? What was your experience of seeing it? You just want to toss out anything?
I mean, it's pretty emotional because it has all the names on it.
Yeah. So yeah, the way you're seeing it here is
Yeah,
very different
there's
from how
tons
you
of
would
people
experience it.
And it's like you can't. It's almost like you can't talk when you're in front of it. You have to be very like respectful.
Yeah.
You can't, and you're just taking it all in and not saying anything, even if you can't like even if you don't necessarily have like a particular reason to visit the site. You still kind of like walk along and you're taking it all in. It's just kind of interesting.
Yeah, and that's interesting because your first responses are that it's this emotional experience, and when the kind of the background on this was that there was a Vietnam Veterans Association that was coming up with the funds for it. So it's it's on federal property and so on, but it was all the funds were privately raised. There was a huge open call, an open competition for it. So anybody who wanted to could submit a design for it. So there were lots of professional firms like architectural firms and professional artists who submitted designs. There were also all sorts of people. There were some kind of crazy designs that were submitted as well. In the end, I think there were something like 2,000 or 3,000 designs. And there was a committee that was pulled together, and it included a kind of a wide variety of people, Vietnam veterans and, people who understood the arts, kind of in the art world, some people who were not. So there was this idea to have kind of a broad, constituency. They ended up choosing Maya Lin's proposal, which is kind of amazing because it was, especially for the time period, in terms of it being a war memorial, was completely different from any other kind of war memorial that had really been made up until that point. It really changed people's, eventually over time, it's really changed people's ideas of what a memorial can be like, in particular a war memorial. So with this aerial view here, you get a sense of it from this view here, with this aerial view, you're looking at a landscape that there's kind of a slight slope to it. And it's essentially this notch that's been cut, and it appears as if it's sort of been cut into the ground, so you actually kind of walk down into it and come out of it if you continue walking along the wall. But essentially, it's a minimalist design. It's really, a simple, kind of a simple kind of form. And the way that it functions, the way Lynn wanted it to function, in part had to do with the requirements of the proposals, is that one of the requirements for the memorial is it had to list the name of every person who was killed during the Vietnam War. And the war, and most people think of it as just in the 1960s, but the war actually begins in the late 1950s with the deaths of some kind of CIA officers. It peaks in the late 1960s, and then it concludes in the almost in the mid-1970s. So it's a pretty long period of time. And her concern, she had two ideas really in this respect in terms of how it should function. One had to do with listing all of the names. And her concern was if you just did an alphabetical listing, names would get lost. She said if you looked at them, they had the documentation available. And she said if you looked at just the number of Smiths, there were hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of Smiths. And that bothered her because she felt like you would lose the sense of individuality. So she designed it to where, it starts kind of very narrowly here, gets deeper, and then tapers off, which follows the pattern of deaths as well. And the names are listed according to time, so it's kind of a chronology. So very few deaths at the beginning. Its peak here around 1969 or so, and then it tapers off as the conflict gets, or the war comes closer to being concluded. And the other thing so that's one important aspect of the design. And then the other aspect of the design and a concept that she was working with was the idea was that a memorial is not really for the dead, it's for the living. And that people should be able to react to it. And she wanted it to literally be reflective, right? So it's these polished black granite walls that when you stand in front of it, if it's, especially if it's a bright day, you see reflections in it. You can potentially see your own reflection in it, and you can get really close to the names as well. And so this was her design. This was a design that was chosen, and it turned into this huge, ugly political battle that Washington seems to be really good at. And part of the concern was because was that nobody had seen anything quite like this before. And just as an example, one of the best-known war memorials, certainly up until this point, is the Marine. Oops, there's a typo. There should be an S on the end of Corps. Is the Marine Corps memorial that was completed in the mid 1950s. And the way most people thought of war memorials in particular was that they should be figurative, right? They should have kind of heroic images in this respect, and that was kind of the expectation, the kind of cultural expectation of what a war memorial would be like. When Lynn's proposal was being shown to the public, certainly there were some people who were on board with it, but there were lots of people. There was a Vietnam veterans group that was concerned that the design itself, if we go back to it, this looked like a big scar, that it would look like a big black scar in this respect. There were other people who just really were not on board with minimalist type sculpture. They couldn't understand art that wasn't figurative and had some kind of narrative embedded in it. Mike, we can ask you a question if that's not your hand. Yeah, okay. So for most people, they couldn't understand how it would work. And what's interesting was that, and there's a documentary about all of this. It's really good and worth watching because it really follows, everything that happens and really how very ugly it got. The committee that was behind it really stood behind it. They really felt like it would work. And the interesting thing is after it opened, then it's interesting too, those of you who've been there, you talk about the emotional experience of being there. Is that people had really emotional responses to it. And it has to do with how it's designed. You can get close to it, you can touch it, right? Other sculptures you're not supposed to touch, right, in case you'll damage them. But this encourages you to touch it. One of the critiques was it might take time to find a person's name because the National Park Service administers it, and they provide a list of names and where they're located on the wall, so if you're looking for a particular name. And Lynn's argument was, if somebody who died and you're looking for their name, you're going to invest a few minutes to find their name, and that's part of how the sculpture functions, is you spend time with it. There's just kind of journey, to find that individual. And people are also encouraged to take rubbings from the surface. So, and if you do that, you put a piece of paper and like a crayon or something, and kind of lift that image, then you're taking something with you. And you get to take that with you after you leave. And people, and you can see it even here in this photograph here, where people have left things. Everything that people leave, and people left really touching, kind of mementos. Anything that's not perishable. It goes to the Smithsonian Institution, and so everything is a part of that collection and is documented. And there's at least one book that I know of that the Smithsonian has published that's photographs of some of the things that have been left. If you want a good cry, just flip through that book. It's really, it's really emotional. Some of the things, the notes that have been left. So what I find really interesting about this is right around the same time period, you've got two sculptors, and Lynn is kind of an interesting person too. She's trained as an architect and a sculptor, so she really functions, sometimes simultaneously and in both ways, and sometimes separately. They've created two works that in some ways have a lot of similarities, but they function very differently. Yeah.
I was wondering if you knew the symbols, but isn't there like a cross and like a diamond that they used to represent if they were like a prisoner of war, if they were like missing in action?
Oh, I think, I'm not sure about that actually.
Because I remember thinking,
and that may be,
when I learned about it, like it was genius, because if they're found later like to be something else, like they could easily change that cross into like a diamond by like chiseling away or however.
Yeah, well, because you just add it to it,
and
because you can't remove it.
That's something that like I might worry about as an artist, like producing something to the scale. Like if something were to change in it, like I'd want it to be able to be corrected, and I just thought that was really smart of her.
Yeah, and I'll look into that because that would make sense, and that wouldn't surprise me because she's really thoughtful. I mean, she's very thoughtful in that respect. Because they did include names that were MIA. And I had this really bizarre experience. It was shortly after the memorial was opened. And the interest, and this was another point I think that's important too, is that people never really got on board with Serra's sculpted art. Even if it was a small number of people who wanted it demolished, there wasn't a bigger voice saying no, we should leave this in place. For Lynn's work, there were a lot of people who did not want it to be constructed. But once it opened and once people understood, how it functions, they either had an experience with it or they saw how other people experienced it, it totally changed. And today, this is the single most visited monument in Washington, D.C. So it's like the favorite, if you want to think of it that way, monument. And even the leader of this was a few years ago, the person who was the head of the Vietnam veterans group that was really vehemently opposed to it, in an interview had said that he's changed his mind on it. That he over time he came to understand how it functions. But it was when it was in I have this memory. It was in the news, and I was watching. It was like NBC Nightly News or something like that. And they did this large panoramic shot, and then just focused in on a single name. And the name that they focused on was a cousin of mine who was shot down and was missing in action and eventually declared killed in action. And that was bizarre. Like everybody in my family was talking about it because we were all watching, this news broadcast. But it kind of brought home, the experience of how names are listed is really, powerful. And this idea of somehow maintaining the sense of individuality within this sort of sea of names, is certainly really significant. So it's interesting. It's a sculpture. One sculpture fails, the other succeeds.
This piece is really interesting to me on an emotional level because, in the ironic sense, it's because a name isn't on there.
Mm-hmm.
My grandfather, I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for this situation. But he was sent over to Vietnam, and coincidentally, when they sent him over, it had ended, so they sent him back home. So when they sent him back home, he married my grandmother, and my grandmother and him had my mother, who had me later on down the line. So if the war hadn't been over coincidentally, his name could have been on there, and I might have known.
Yeah, and lots of people too.
Yeah.
Right? And one of the things about this sculpture that I think is interesting is that in our lifetime, there's still a lot of Vietnam veterans, and there's still a lot of relatives of Vietnam veterans, so we can have this really kind of emotional connection to it, especially when it first opened. The war hadn't been over for a particularly long period of time, so lots of people visiting it had been there, and so that's significant too. What I'm curious about is what happens over time. How will people respond to it 50 years from now or 100 years from now, when there's more disconnects, from that time period, and it might, it may still function as powerfully, but I have a feeling it may, potentially it may kind of change over time. So that's, I think, an interesting comparison to kind of bring in, to talking about Richard Serra's work. Maya Lin is we'll we might touch on her a little bit before the end of the semester again, but she's a really interesting artist in a number of ways. Definitely, I'll talk about her in the art and the environment class, because she's done a number of projects that bring environmental issues together as well. I just wanted to show you this here. I was in St. Louis a couple of years ago, and this was a sculpture that was installed at about the same time as Tilted Art. And it was really interesting. It's in an interesting location because there's this big sort of green space in the center of downtown. Serra's sculpture was in this kind of it's literally like kind of a lawn in a way, this grass lawn, these big metal panels that have openings, and then you can see light kind of breaking through here. So it allows you can still walk across the space, but it breaks up that space. And then the next couple of blocks, there are more contemporary kinds of sculptures, and they're really more like gardens in a lot of ways. So if you ever go to St. Louis, you should go to downtown and check this out. It's definitely worth visiting. It was the first time I had seen a Serra work like this, that was from the early 80s. And, and I kind of liked it and kind of disliked it. I mean, I kind of disliked it, especially compared to the other more recent stuff, which was definitely more appealing and inviting in a lot of ways. But one of the things that really struck me was when you looked at the panels, the patina that was on the panels, because I was so used to seeing images, bump back a little bit. Sorry, there were so many. I was used to seeing photographs like this, where you see that kind of iron oxide, that kind of red iron oxide surface. And so I was really surprised. I mean, that was there, but there were lots of amazing colors, like blues and reds and even some yellows as well. And so people probably thought I was nuts because I'm standing right over there and going, ooh, So there's this kind of aesthetic, aspect to it that was really interesting, and I didn't necessarily expect. So as you get into the 1990s, this is the kind of work that Serra's really much more known for today. As you get into the 90s, and this also has to do with an artist who's got the financial resources to make these things. He generally builds models that are pretty small, that could kind of fit on a tabletop. And then these have to be, even the other big pieces, they're manufactured, by companies that work with steel. This is also Corten steel, but if you look at them carefully, you can see they're really pretty. If you imagine trying to manufacture steel in this scale, there's a person standing here, to give you a sense of it. They're very organic, and the interesting thing is if you think about that really early work that Serra had made. With the rubber belts, and I remember I had mentioned that idea that he was interested in these industrial materials that have flexibility, and even steel itself has a certain kind of flex. When he's talked about these sculptures in particular, this kind of body of work, he's talked about the fact that that steel actually has a kind of stretch to it, it has a flexibility, and these are designed to kind of draw your attention to that. The other thing about them is they're really designed for you to have a physical experience with them. You need to walk up to them and into them, and you can even, if you can fit in here, you can kind of squeeze, through these inner, those kind of inner walls that you see. They kind of lean forward into your space or away from your space. And he's also interestingly talked about an experience that he had when he was a little kid. He grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area, and he remembers one day his father taking him to the Alameda shipyards, which is where they build, they still build ships today. I think they used to build Navy boats there in the past. And there was a ship that was being launched. So basically what he got to see was a ship out of the water, that huge hull, that form that curves, that's made out of steel. And he got to see it, literally, kind of get pushed or launched into the water. And he's talked about how that experience just has stuck with him. And I think that's kind of intriguing that in some ways his use of this material at this scale and kind of the patterns that happen have to do with something that happened to him as a kid. And it's really kind of evocative, and it's kind of stuck with him over an extended period of time. Well, I don't have time to talk about Agnes Martin, and I'm going to show you a really short little video clip of her too. She's a painter, and so we'll shift away from sculpture toward painting. And Agnes Martin is one of those artists, and I know that I probably, you get tired of hearing me say this sometimes too, but she's one of those artists whose work you have to see in person, because it's very subtle, and there's a kind of beauty to it, that's certainly a very regular and orderly kind of beauty. But in reproduction, it looks so simple, but it's really not. It has to do with the color and the way that she made the images. Martin is really known for work that looks like this. This is the example that's in the text called Night Sea, and I can show you another example here, an untitled work from the 1970s. So even or late 70s, so you can see even over over a 10-year period of time, this kind of repetition. These are essentially paintings of gridded forms. But what's important to know about these is that she does not use any kind of device to create the grid. So no strings, no masking tape, no straight edges. These are all free hands in terms of how they're painted. I know, right? And it's important that when you know that, and I've always found that if I've ever had the opportunity to see them in person, I'm always looking at them like, how the hell did she do that, right? And if you read anything that she's written or interviews with her, she seemed like she died in the early 2000s, and she was working, right up until the end. But she just seems like she was really, really thoughtful and has this kind of Zen-like look at the world. And I can imagine her, kind of coinciding her heartbeat to her hand or something like that, You have to, yeah. And she speaks kind of very deeply and philosophically, which I think is interesting, because her work is really full of lots of really rich, kind of complex ideas, but yet the output is very orderly. The other thing too is she was also really interested in mathematics, which you might not, which kind of makes sense, and not so much like higher math, like calculus and stuff like that, but just more, I guess you think of as like simpler kind of mathematics. And I need to find an image of her notebooks. Her notebooks are, and sometimes just strings of, I don't even know if equations is the right word, but these kind of mathematical problems that have been worked out. So lots of numbers, very, very kind of orderly. So to give you a little bit better sense of her, at least her personality, we'll shift over to the internet real quick. There's a film about her that I would like to find and see. This is just the trailer for it. The first about minute and a half or so, you see her in her studio working and talking. And I think the ideas, even just for the trailer, I think the ideas are pretty interesting. Keep in mind, when this was produced, I think she was about 90 years old, and she's still making these, big paintings. So I'm always impressed when artists are like working right up till the end, Oh, let me make sure I got the volume up. Yeah.
Somebody once asked me, what was my happiest moment painting? I told them when they go out the door. Go out into the world. If you wake up in the morning and you feel very happy about nothing, no cause, that's when I paint about the subtle emotions that we feel without cause in this world. And I'm hoping that people, when they respond to them, will realize that they make responses that are completely abstract, and that their lives are broader than they think.
So I'll pause there because then it just goes into text and telling you a little bit about the film. And even just a little snippet, right? That's something to consider, that we have abstract responses. And imagine, how do you paint happiness, right? And just, and happiness for no reason, on top of it. So that's a fairly upbeat way, I hope, to end the week. Other thing, too, about Martin to consider is she grew up and worked in New York and then went to Taos, New Mexico. And the light in Taos is very, I think, an important part of her work. So on this rainy day, I think